So I'm used to hearing my canned bio, and Jack severely edited my canned bio. So thank you, Jack. That was kind of got me emotional. So I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here, and hi. I'm so happy to join you this afternoon. And despite the title of my talk, I'm actually grateful for this opportunity to share my optimism for the future of landscape architecture and the importance of sharing our profession across what I see as arbitrary national boundaries. I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind adventure, so please bear with me. Now, as you might have gleaned from my bio, I've frequently been told how lucky I am. I was lucky to discover landscape architecture when I was a kid. I was lucky to have landed a job at an intellectually stimulating and nurturing firm, and lucky to travel the world. In fact, there are so many quotes about being lucky in life that it's mind-boggling. But let me tell you, it wasn't luck. But first, though, and this might be a little bit self-serving, but there are a few things I want you to know about me. This is where I grew up, suburban hell, a cul-de-sac outside of Cleveland. You can't make this up. But this landscape shaped who I am more than any other, and it was actually pretty great. My backyard was a decent-sized wooded area with what I thought when I was 5 years old was the coolest, most enchanted creek in the world. These pictures aren't of me, but I spent hours in that creek, skipping rocks, searching for frogs and salamanders, building islands and waterfalls. It was my very first canvas. And as an only child, growing up under the free-range parenting style of the 1980s, that creek was also my best friend. As I grew up, my bike expanded my access to even more landscapes. In Cleveland, I was lucky to be surrounded by the emerald necklace of the Metro Park system. My bike became my chariot, taking me to even bigger landscapes that were shaped by glaciers as they rolled over the landscape and melted to form the Great Lakes. It carried me to designed landscapes too, even though I didn't know they were necessarily designed at the time, like Stan Hewitt Hall and the Gwynn Estate by Warren Manning, or the Cleveland Mall by Daniel Burnham. As a teenager, I became obsessed with the transformation of downtown Cleveland. For my entire childhood, I was embarrassed of where I was from. The mistake on the lake, the river that caught on fire, which you're welcome, by the way, you have the EPA because of that. But in the 90s, things were starting to change. I took the light rail into the city to observe its urban transformation. And I started to do some research that led me to landscape architecture and to Sasaki. It was around that same time that my best friend, who I was still close to, even as a teenager, betrayed me. That creek that I loved, it turns out, was the stormwater runoff from the mall parking lot up the hill. My entire childhood was spent splashing around in hydrocarbons. Awesome. And then one day, I was at the library, back when we had to go to an actual physical library to find information, and I stumbled upon Landscape Architecture magazine. I think I was maybe 14 or 15 years old. It rocked my world. I quickly discovered that I didn't have to be an architect, but there was something different. And then I started researching college programs. I went to Cornell. I met Marv Edelman, who was one of Hideo Sasaki's original students and first employees. He took us on a field trip to Boston, and the rest is history. But none of that was luck. What it was privilege. I was privileged to have a childhood where I was safe and I could explore. I was privileged to have teachers who guided me. I was privileged to have parents who never pressured me to be like them, a police officer and a nurse. I was privileged to have professors that nurtured me and encouraged my interest and introduced me to people at a firm that forever changed my life. Fast forward to the formative years of my career. Again, growing up in Ohio, my world was pretty small. We didn't travel much, but when I was 14, I had a relative in the Air Force, and we went to his wedding in London. And 2 years after that, my French class fundraised for a trip to Paris. I was hooked. I was always an explorer, even when I was a kid, but this was different. It was new food, new cultures, and a built environment that looked nothing like what I knew. I came to Sasaki exclusively because of the firm's international practice. And I made it very clear that this was the type of work I wanted to pursue professionally. It was the perfect opportunity to see the world and get paid for doing it without joining the military. This is the image that I think most of my friends and family had in mind whenever I mentioned that I was traveling for work and where I was going. But as we all know, this is the reality. So I just want to say that travel isn't glamorous, and I didn't want to work on international projects because I enjoyed spending 10 hours on an airplane. I chose the path of a global practice because every experience I have brings me joy. For me, travel is only glamorous in retrospect, the memories that you build when you're traveling. Those lived, shared experiences that travel affords are joyful, memorable, and to me, life-affirming. Travel connects me with my teams, my clients, the communities my work is meant to serve. We're a place-based profession, and we should spend every moment immersing ourselves in new experiences. Now, one of the many things that brings me joy is expanding access to parks in the various places that I'm lucky enough to work. I'm going to walk you through two quick case studies in Shanghai, Zhangjabang Park and Hongkou Stadium. In Shanghai, Sasaki was engaged to design the first of 8 green wedges that were planned for the city. And today, Zhangjabang Park is one of Shanghai's largest public parks. A key design consideration was how to instill citizens with an appreciation of the natural systems and complex ecologies of the region. Woodlands were a main component, providing urgently needed forest habitat in Shanghai. The park's design increased tree cover from an existing condition that was fragmented with only about 5% coverage to a proposed contiguous 48% tree coverage. Zhangjabang's complex forest ecosystem offers diverse wildlife habitats, produces over 1,000 tons of oxygen per year, and creates a more comfortable microclimate. A thorough understanding of the authentic ecology of the region influenced a woodland restoration strategy that encouraged biodiversity in multiple forest layers, which are more typical of Shanghai's native landscapes, but are forgotten in the city's contemporary human-centric landscape. In addition to the woodlands, wetlands were another key transformation. Channelized canals were transformed into sinuous riparian corridors to improve water quality and rebuild the biodiversity of the aquatic ecosystem. The park's 46 hectares of restored wetlands will provide an estimated $2 million in ecosystem services annually, while removing about 78% of nitrogen and 49% of phosphorus to further improve water quality in the overall Zhangjabang Canal. This, to me, proved the power of large parks to significantly improve the health of the land around us. A new nature center and conservation hatchery also were designed to support regional aquatic systems restoration, but more importantly, to reconnect city dwellers with the power of nature that hopefully will inspire another kid like me to become a landscape architect. That's my ultimate goal. Also in Shanghai, we're working to rethink how big urban infrastructure, like an elevated transit line and an underutilized stadium, can have a stronger connection to landscape. The existing Hongkou Stadium is going through an epic transformation to bring it up to FIFA standards to one day host the World Cup, but also to create a health and wellness destination that is more closely connected to nature. Our strategy was remarkably simple. Extend the existing park through the stadium, lift it to meet the level of the elevated light rail line, and then infuse a variety of new recreational programs to make it a destination. We also saw an opportunity to rethink underutilized space underneath the existing light rail line. We call it the midline. A little tongue-in-cheek nod to the High Line. It's really Shanghai's answer to the High Line, which creates a miles-long path above the city streets while connecting the entry podium of the stadium to the light rail. Where spectators once had to descend stairs and cross a busy road to access the stadium, they can now directly access it from that transit platform. Most importantly, though, we pulled the park right through the stadium itself. This allowed people to freely watch the action on the field as they meander through the landscape. To me, this makes the experience a much more democratic one. It eliminates the notion that watching the game in person is an activity reserved only for those who can afford a ticket to the game. The upper levels of the stadium, we have a new cantilevered ring that supports a variety of community recreational programming. It's open 24/7, even on game days, with a public green roof that offers panoramic views of the entire Shanghai skyline. Now, growing up in suburbia and then watching the transformation of Cleveland instilled in me a passion for cities. I love their vibrancy, their complexity, their diversity. So another thing that brings me joy is the opportunity not only to visit new cities, but to envision them as greener, more connected, and more equitable places that allow humanity to thrive. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the design of our cities required a paradigm shift because societal pressures and a reaction against the disorder and inequality of the industrial age was necessary. Essentially, people were dying from epidemic diseases as a result of poor sanitation. I would argue that COVID-19 has led to some similar revelations of the importance of landscape in cities. But at that time, urban slums, congestion, disorder, ugliness, and the threat of disease provoked a reaction in which improvements to the sanitary condition of cities was the first priority. Significant betterment of public health resulted from engineering improvements in water supply and sewerage, which were essential to the future growth of those urban populations. And landscape architects were often leading those efforts. Similar issues are still happening in developing countries around the world today, which is why I believe that landscape architects have a critical role to play in those parts of the world. I'm channeling Richard Weller at Penn, who developed a series of maps called the Atlas for the End of the World, which documents some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Now, many of these are in direct conflict with rapidly expanding cities in Asia and Africa, and how we design cities in these regions to protect sensitive habitats, reduce sprawl into natural areas, and provide access to nature so that people still feel connected to the landscape within an urban environment, to me is essential. One of these cities we're currently working in is Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, where we're helping the city envision a more equitable connection to its riverfront. The site today consists of a former port defined by its industrialized landscape of hard edges, historic customs houses, warehouses, and port infrastructure. But for over 150 years, port activities prevented the adjacent neighborhood from accessing the river for generations, leading to an inwardly focused community that lacked visual and physical connections to the water. This created an urban slum that many in the government would have liked to have seen torn down. But these neighborhoods are critical to the life of the city. Our goal became simply to upgrade these settlements humanely rather than eliminate them in the name of progress. In Ho Chi Minh City, although the neighborhood adjacent to the port is a thriving community of over 180,000 people, it's historically been a marginalized community with significantly less open space than other districts in Ho Chi Minh. An analysis of existing physical and social assets, demographics, transportation, climate conditions, native ecologies, provided foundational data which influenced a series of design principles. The primary goal really became a desire to increase the amount, the accessibility, and the connectivity of public open space throughout the entire district. But to further complicate things, Ho Chi Minh is also ranked among the top 10 global cities most vulnerable to climate change, with sea levels projected to rise about 10 inches by 2050. This image was taken immediately adjacent to our site. I don't think that's a good way to go about your daily commute, but we realized we therefore needed to design a series of edge treatments that respond to a variety of existing and proposed conditions to protect not just the new development, but the population of the entire district. The riverfront landscape was designed as a gradually ascending riparian zone that can accommodate these floodwaters over time. And the landscape also needed to work in tandem with architecture and seek ways to future-proof itself. I think in the not-so-distant future, when we need less underground parking due to advances in shared mobility, underground garages will be repurposed as cisterns for storing floodwaters, which is what we designed here. These streetscapes were designed as water-receiving landscapes as well, diverting rainwater into cisterns and bioswales rather than into city storm sewers. But the science behind the design and getting the public to embrace novel ideas of designing cities can sometimes be at odds. So to overcome any misconceptions, we help to engage the public in a dialogue and walk them through how cities could be improved and impact their daily lives at the same time. So through interviews with local residents, we developed a series of avatars that are simplifications of real people that we spoke to on numerous site visits. We then guided each of them through an example of what their daily life might look like and how they might use the various spaces that we were creating. So really kind of connecting them to this future landscape. Many of them were concerned about losing their cultural identity and how to protect the dynamism and vitality of their current neighborhood. So we work with them to imagine what these upgraded streets might look like. Interior streets that offer shaded outdoor cafes, market plazas that create places to trade and gather and celebrate, pocket parks that offer intimate experiences, and pedestrian corridors that recall Saigon's narrow alleyways. In addition to these active streets, we created 11 new civic plazas along the river where people could gather, whether for large events or just to catch up on daily gossip. And we did so as a richly textured experience that maximizes exposure to difference, to diversity, to the unforeseen, and to me, the very essence of what makes us social beings. My favorite of these plazas is across the river from Ho Chi Minh City's new soccer stadium, where we created a space that thrives on the energy of the stadium's noise and lights, but where the game can be broadcast on a floating screen that allows everyone to view the game in a more public celebratory setting. And again, even if you can't afford a ticket to the game, I don't know about you, but I'd much rather be here than in the crammed seats of any stadium any day. Now, another fallacy that really bugs me is when people that tell me that I'm so lucky to have found my passion. Since when was passion singular or static? I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room is not so one-dimensional as to do only one thing that you love. I'm passionate about travel, food, landscape architecture, urban design, ecology, campfire stories, murder mysteries, advertising. Seriously, I love commercials. The list is extensive. Passions evolve, as people do. I cringe when people ask my kids what they want to be when they grow up. What you're passionate about in this particular moment might not be your passion in the future. You should always be open-minded to new experiences and new paths that life is leading you down. So don't chase your passion, and don't freak out if you haven't figured it out yet. Chase your purpose. Purpose is the reason for your journey. Passion is merely the fire that lights the way. One of my current purposes is figuring out what we as landscape architects can do to help the world adapt to climate change. I'm not the only one fighting this fight, but it means being at the table to write policy, working upstream in planning and urban design, and understanding that it is a multifaceted global issue that we need to be involved in at all scales. In Wuhan, we're rethinking the existing waterfront to work more efficiently. This is the part where I used to have to explain where Wuhan is. I don't have to do that anymore, which is great. But Wuhan's currently dominated by significant infrastructure, really high levees along this park. The existing conditions are this repetitive and monotonous experience that is unsafe during seasonal flooding. It lacks any kind of cultural programming, and it's offering very little ecological benefit. Wuhan and the Yangtze River, though, have historically shared this very intimate symbiotic relationship until rapid urbanization and infrastructure, higher levees separated the river from its citizens. But living with the Yangtze is so deeply embedded that people still frequent the riverfront even when it's flooded, enjoying that intimate contact with water. Straddling about a 10-kilometer stretch on both banks of the river, our expanded park will provide a landscape foreground to Wuhan's riverfront skyline and create a contiguous public waterfront for the entire city. We began by organizing a variety of very complex existing site conditions into essentially 5 spatial components: the bridges, the barges, the marsh, the park, and the embankment. You can see that I overly simplify my design solutions whenever I can, because that's how you can kind of connect it to people. We then looked at what was damaged, starting with the site's ecology. Over the past 40 years, sediment in the Yangtze River has dropped by as much as 90% due to the construction of upstream dams like the Three Gorges Dam, which is a serious threat to the river's ecologically beneficial mudflats. You need that sediment to provide the ecosystem for all of those little creatures to live in the mud. Our design, therefore, proposed a really complex wetland community that was supported by nuanced topographic changes, a diverse planting palette based on inundation levels, and habitat elements, including nesting platforms and loafing logs that contribute to the overall wetland's health. Frequent flooding, strategic dredging, and precise grading helps to replenish the nutrient-rich sediment and reestablish distinct habitat zones that increase biodiversity in that mudflat ecosystem. We also looked at damaged infrastructure. Remnants of Wuhan's freight train terminals, where train cars were transferred to barges to continue their journey downstream to Shanghai, were a very significant existing element and a key component to honor the site's industrial legacy. These industrial elements were repurposed as public art. In low water, the park reveals its industrial heritage, recalling the river's previous uses, while rising water triggers this interactive light installation and accents inundated remnants and highlights the river's power. Recommissioned gangways and catwalks provided access to floating stages for outdoor art exhibits and performances, and seating areas were elevated to allow for performances even in flood conditions. Rethinking obsolete infrastructure was another key component of the plan. There were 68 abandoned barges and other infrastructural elements throughout the park that were initially slated for removal, but we adaptively reused as floating gardens, performance stages, cafes, and art galleries. The barges then form this planted promenade that rises and falls with the river and delineates kind of a floodable plaza. The plaza's undulating metal mesh grid transforms into islands for wildlife to rest on when that plaza is submerged. The design for the park also went through an extensive public engagement strategy. We had open meetings, site tours, a community arts program, including a living legacy project that people could document the river's change over time through family photographs. This resulted in a really abundant level of feedback and provided the programming ideas that directly influenced design iteration. So to increase engagement, we also built a website to keep the public informed. This was right as COVID was happening, so we transitioned from all those in-person sessions to a more kind of online presence that people could track the park's progress, which helped us solicit additional input from over 65,000 citizens. I've never had a public engagement process that large, but that's what China allows you to do. Now, a huge contributor to climate change that I feel isn't getting the attention it deserves is agriculture. I'm really excited about your next lecture because that sounds like it's really going to touch on the issue of food security. I'm a strong believer that landscape architects should be at the forefront of rethinking our relationship with food. This is another area where I find purpose. With 10 billion people to feed, this is first and foremost a land use issue, and that's what we do best. What we're experiencing now is not the future that we were promised, I was promised. When I was a kid in the 1980s, Willy Wonka suggested that chewing a piece of gum would provide me with the same nutrition as eating a 3-course meal. Pan Am was going to offer a nutritional pill lunch for your next transatlantic flight. The Jetsons promised us a machine where our food would magically appear at the push of a button. Unfortunately, these visions of the future have led us down a path of convenient processed foods. Around the world, there are 19 million hectares of rainforests that are lost every year. This destruction doesn't just release carbon, it also reduces biodiversity, increases the threat of diseases like COVID-19. By infringing on these habitats, we're reducing the natural barriers between humans and host species. We're essentially creating the ideal conditions for these diseases to spread. These microbes are not naturally human pathogens. They become human pathogens because we allow them that opportunity. Every day, 1 in 8 people globally is hungry. So our food decisions are a huge contributor to carbon and to water scarcity. And I don't have time to get into all the details. That can be a whole separate talk, which maybe you're going to get. But all of that's to say that food as we know it today is not sustainable. In China, the problem of growing cities is especially acute, with people and agriculture competing for the same land. All of China's arable land lies in the eastern half of the country, which also corresponds to where about 93% of the population lives. This conflict has resulted in a sobering amount of agricultural land lost to development, about 123,000 square kilometers in the span of a decade. For those of you who need a visual aid, that's just about equivalent to the size of the state of Iowa, lost to development. Of the farmland that remains, about 20% of that is contaminated. Again, for you visual folks, those polluted areas represent just about half the landmass of California. China's use of pesticides and fertilizer is rising faster than any other country on Earth, and with dire consequences. That burger you ate for dinner last night or for lunch today, 660 gallons of water went into producing one burger. And cattle production is responsible for 80% of the planet's deforestation. In China, imports of beef have increased 19,000% in the last decade. So at the Sunshao Urban Farm in Shanghai, we're building a collection of vertical farms that will supply much of the city's leafy greens locally, year-round, and at an economically viable scale. Chinese cities are perfect for vertical farming. Most cities are actually, but in Shanghai, the average diet consists of about 56% leafy greens. We should all be getting half of our calories from vegetables anyway, but the point is that leafy greens are the ideal crop for hydroponic systems. These systems increase yields by about 40 to 100 times what a traditional soil-based farm could produce. And Sunshao is also a living laboratory, which allows Shanghai's urban residents, many of whom have never even seen a working farm, to learn about how food can be grown. So I believe that vertical agriculture, like at Sunshao, needs to quickly become a fixture in cities around the world. Another project that we're doing that's changing the paradigm of how we think about the integration of agriculture and the urban environment is at Songzhuan, which is a 40 square kilometer new district on the outskirts of Beijing. At Songzhuan, we work to create a new development model that would embrace agriculture rather than displace it. So instead of the typical approach where development pushes the farms aside, the idea is for development to embrace agriculture and make it part of the urban experience. This particular concept built off the use of agriculture to support textiles and fashion, as well as alternative medicine like biotech, pharmaceuticals, which proves that the entire economic sector relies on agriculture to thrive, and that direct access to agriculture might help to improve supply chain and foster more innovation and research. The Songzhuan model provides a direct connection between the land used to grow the resources we need for modern life, providing an understanding of our impact and an appreciation for its scarcity rather than seeing land as a commodity. This is an image that we created to just describe the character of the residential areas in the plan, which would help educate people and engage them in the production of locally sourced food. This next project, Lim Chu Kang, which we just completed last month, is in Singapore, which some of you know is a small island nation with very little land and very little natural resources. In fact, only about 1% of Singapore's land is used for farming, which means they need to import nearly all of their food from other places. This is not a good position to be in from a food security perspective. But Singapore is a very progressive nation, and a new government agency, the Singapore Food Agency, was established to shift this dynamic. Their mandate is for 30% of all food consumed in Singapore to be grown in Singapore by 2030, 7 years away. So we developed a comprehensive plan for them that looked at scaling up agricultural operations to produce enough to feed over 1.7 million people annually. And not just that, but to position Singapore as a global leader for agricultural research and education, such that they can then create a new economic sector that would export this specialized knowledge to other cities around the world. Our concept, again, I love simple concepts, was the Lim Chu Kang lunchbox. It's a metaphor for our vision of a modular, stacked, and shareable urban agricultural district. Given the ambitious objectives of the project, we worked collaboratively with engineers and agronomists to predict production yields and to calculate energy demand, water demand, and generated waste, and then to understand how each would contribute to an entirely circular closed-loop system. And though this necessitated that a majority of the land at Lim Chu Kang be dedicated to production and vertical farms, at the core, we developed an immersive experience for people in this nation of foodies to learn about the future of agriculture. The Hawker Center evolves the idea of a traditional Singaporean food court known as hawker stalls, where visitors can do more than just eat. Guests can also learn how food grows in a vertical farm. They can pick their own ingredients for their salad, and they can participate in live cooking demonstrations. Similarly, the Central Market is meant to be an immersive destination where visitors can shop, dine, listen to local music, or take classes at the Culinary Academy. The idea is for it to become a new model for a more engaging, educational, and immersive supermarket experience. If you want more, you can also book a stay in the Farm Village, where you can participate in traditional soil-based agriculture or harvesting food with your family to take home. And again, it's all part of an educational process designed to connect people to both the land, but also to experimental technologies that illustrate how we can make farming more efficient and environmentally responsible. The auction arena is one of my favorite places, is also blurring the lines of and boundaries between edutainment, where food can take a center stage. Here you can watch live food auctions as produce is sold to restaurants and hotels and follow live market prices. The goal is really to make the cost of food production transparent. Along the main spine, the collaboration market and test plots make research visible. It's also the home base for visiting scholars and students to learn from the innovation happening at Lim Chu Kang to bring back to their home cities around the world. And finally, the logistics center is where food is processed, packaged, and shipped. But it's also an opportunity to get behind the scenes to see where these activities, including how waste is turned into energy. So really making everything about food totally transparent and visible and relatable. This is a complicated word for me. And I think none of these words, luck, glamour, passion, or prestige, I don't think they're bad words. I think they're just nuanced. But I don't particularly like prestige. To me, it implies exclusivity rather than inclusivity. It conveys power rather than compassion. I find it pretty empty. And again, I realize that I'm in a position of power and privilege, but I don't think that those should afford me any kind of prestige, but rather should come with a sense of duty and responsibility. And as landscape architects, that's where we should focus our efforts, on stewardship, on equity, and on environmental justice. And even more so with highly visible projects that everyone can experience and learn from, like I'm trying to do as Sasaki. One of the greatest responsibilities I think we have is to champion habitat conservation, to advocate for the species that can't speak for themselves, and to foster biodiversity with every opportunity we have as those that shape the landscape. We're currently working at the Chengdu Panda Reserve, which is the world's most comprehensive facility for genetic research, breeding, rehabilitation, and the reintroduction of pandas into the wild. It's embarking on an ambitious expansion from 165 acres currently to over 16,000 acres to support amplified conservation efforts adjacent to the newly established Giant Panda National Park, which is China's first national park. And this development pressure is real, as this map, again, from Richard Weller's Atlas for the End of the World, illustrates the mountains of southwest China, which is the primary remaining habitat for pandas, is falling below critical conservation targets. The reserve acts as the ex situ conservation strategy for that new national park. Its mission is to integrate scientific research and habitat restoration alongside public outreach and education. And its expansion is meant to ease development pressure for tourist-based projects on sensitive habitats near that national park. The expansion of the reserve proposes 3 distinct sites to support the reserve's overarching mission. Longquanshan Panda Village is the primary site for public education and visitation. Beihu Panda Park supports research and breeding. And Dujiangyang Panda Wilderness facilitates rehabilitation and re-entry into the wild. We began with a rigorous landscape analysis that drove the reserve's expansion strategy. We did detailed studies of elevation, slope, exposure, microclimate, hydrology, and vegetation that informed our site selection. And we concentrated on locations that offered landscape typologies which resembled the preferred habitat requirements of pandas and their companion species. And although the reserve is located beyond the panda's established range, GIS and on-site analysis of potential sites resulted in the prioritization of landscapes with characteristics that facilitate the rehabilitation and transition of juveniles that are born in captivity to eventual release into the wild. No panda ever born in captivity has yet to be released into the wild. So this is the center that's hopefully going to be the first to do that. New facilities were carefully integrated into existing topography and were concentrated only on previously disturbed sites. And landscape restoration strategies emulate native habitats that allow researchers to train juvenile pandas to acclimate conditions in the wild, including seeking shelter, foraging for food, and perceiving danger. And yes, researchers even dress up in panda suits to facilitate this process. I think that's a pretty awesome job. Probably gets pretty hot under there. We also did detailed plant inventories documenting species that pandas rely on for nutrition and shelter, which guided site selection and landscape restoration methodologies, and hydrological studies that identified access to freshwater resources. Enclosure guidelines were expanded from a current 600 square meters per panda to 15,000 square meters per panda, which allows more room for them to roam. Now, visitation is a critical component of the reserve's revenue generation strategy, which helps to fund these conservation efforts. But the current facilities, which you can see in these photos on the left here, are very outdated, and they're adversely impacting panda well-being. The redesigned exhibits leverage topography and vegetation, providing a more immersive experience for humans while limiting disruption to pandas. We did a meticulous spatial analysis, which resulted in a design approach that prioritized animal health and comfort. And although the reserve is currently one of the top 5 most visited destinations in China, with nearly the same amount of annual visitors as Disneyland, the expansion plan distributes people to avoid crowds and noise near habitat areas. As an umbrella species, protecting the giant panda also benefits hundreds of other vulnerable, threatened, and endangered species that share its habitat. Our landscape management plan carefully analyzed specific requirements for additional species that can share the reserve's expanded facilities. Working in close coordination with zoologists, conservationists, and habitat specialists, including Dr. Jack Liu at Michigan State University, who wrote the book called Pandas and People. You can't have a better consultant for a project like this than that. We created this matrix of ecological microzones that are most appropriate for various companion species, and cited them according to their individual habitat requirements. Now, the reserve is essentially bridging the gap between zoo, nature center, and research complex and cultural destination. And the updated facilities are meant to serve as an outpost for conservation scientists while also providing a forum to educate visitors about the region's exceptional biodiversity, landscapes, and culture. Beyond pandas, the reserve's expansion also presented an opportunity for various cultural experiences that celebrate the architectural vernacular, the cuisine, and the craft of Sichuan province. Our landscape programming study introduced event spaces that offer an added layer of local immersion. And to encourage external engagement with the reserve, we also in-house developed a virtual program to complement the physical plan. This is the Panda Quest app, which teaches younger generations about conservation by guiding a panda on a journey through the landscape in search of food. Panda Quest allows virtual visitors to donate, to volunteer, and to interact with the reserve from anywhere in the world, but it's also designed to enhance your physical visit with participatory experiences like collecting bamboo for the panda kitchen. Now, another responsibility that we must act upon with more urgency is to reduce both operational and embodied carbon in all of our work, which is directly impacted by the design decisions that we make every day. At the 798 Arts District in Beijing, it's one of the most transformational projects I've been lucky to work on. In 2004, the district faced destruction in the name of progress, with plans to tear it down and build new high-rise residential towers. We worked really, really quickly to catalog its unique industrial aesthetic and to create a plan to lobby city leaders on its potential. The site was formerly a collection of East German designed and Chinese operated weapons factories. The goal of the plan was to use public space as a means to transform a place that manufactured munitions into one that generates art and ideas instead, something that unites us in our shared humanity rather than producing something that destroys. At the outset of the design process, existing buildings, industrial artifacts, and landscapes were cataloged and assessed for their structural integrity, their aesthetic value, their potential for adaptive reuse, and their ability to frame new public space. And to protect what we really saw as this great mid-century marvel, we started with three big moves that guided the design thinking. In the district's core, the focus was on the adaptive reuse of historic factories. At the edges, empty lots were an opportunity for new development, for creative uses, and uniting them was this public realm of plazas, courtyards, and pedestrian streets. Existing elements ranging from architectural features to industrial artifacts to mature trees were carefully cataloged and integrated into the plan. I love that when the district was built, the East Germans revered these trees so much that they actually built infrastructure like these beam lines around the trees. If you can find any city manager that's willing to do that, give them my number. So the design was especially influenced by three main landscape typologies: these linear parks along the former railway tracks that create a porous entry into the district, primary plazas that provide space for large events adjacent to those key cultural buildings, and secondary plazas that highlight industrial artifacts. The plan established a strategy for the implementation of landscape interventions over time. Serving different constituencies, it needed to respond to community desires for more public parks. It needed to answer the call of cultural institutions that were requesting space for outdoor programming. And it needed to respond to our client, who was a Belgian philanthropist whose grandfather and uncle were both ambassadors to China, who amassed an incredible collection of contemporary Chinese art in the 1980s and 90s that were all living in a warehouse in Geneva, Switzerland, because he was afraid to display them in China for fear of them being taken by the government due to their kind of criticism of the government. Mr. Ullens, who was our client, made his money off of fat Americans. He owned Weight Watchers, which I just love, kind of the full circle of projects like that. So the plan was essentially built over time to honor all of those different needs from each constituency. But a guiding principle was to create flexible spaces that would support intimate daily uses and also host large events like concerts, fashion shows, and seasonal festivities with the backdrop of this industrial aesthetic. I think this is what makes 798 so unique and so Instagrammable. These smaller plazas that celebrate the industrial artifacts that are scattered throughout the district. They house contemporary art installations. They're often used for photo shoots that take advantage of one of Beijing's most distinctive backdrops. It's where Audi and Volkswagen now have their China headquarters within the district as their design centers. Hyundai has their design center there. So it's really become this place for design. The master plan recommended the removal of some buildings that were constructed circa 1990 that blocked the views of the original factory architecture. And that space that was occupied by these structures was identified as an opportunity to increase the public realm with wider sidewalks and small plazas. But overall, we wanted to, rather than tear down the district, which was the original plan, preserve almost every building in the district to limit the need for more carbon in new development. And the result, I think, is an authentic experience that honors the district's industrial legacy and supports its success as what is now the third most visited destination in Beijing after the Forbidden City and the Great Wall of China. And it, again, does so with very little new building stock that overall helps to reduce its carbon footprint. I'm going to end with this one, which is one of the most carbon progressive projects we're working on right now, and I think one of the most carbon progressive landscapes in the world. This is the Ellinikon Metropolitan Park in Athens, Greece. The decommissioning of the original Athens International Airport in 2001 led to 2 decades of work to create a funding and governance mechanism that would transform the city's largest piece of obsolete infrastructure into what is becoming Europe's largest coastal park. The 650-acre site illustrates this layered history of Athenian landscapes, including prehistoric coastal settlements, productive agricultural fields, an encampment for refugees, a 20th century airport, and a 21st century Olympic venue. But it was always used as an inclusive, publicly accessible space. Now, most contemporary Athenians no longer have a home in the countryside, which is displacing this cultural relationship with nature that they've historically celebrated for generations. Similarly, the majority of open spaces in Athens today are either passive landscapes that are adjacent to ancient ruins, or they're hyper-urban plazas and streetscapes. So there's really no tradition of recreational parks in Athens. This is the site as it stands today. Lots of abandoned infrastructure surrounded by a really vibrant community that's fragmented and disconnected from the sea. Currently, the largest redevelopment project in Europe, the Ellinikon alleviates development pressure away from the historic core of Athens, and the Metropolitan Park will be the centerpiece of a new mixed-use district, while the coastal front is the largest public beach within Athens city limits. It's about 2 kilometers in length. With an abundance of leftover materials from the site's past lives, what would typically be discarded was repurposed and even celebrated. The former terminal building is adaptively reused, light poles are relocated and repainted, and concrete is mined from the tarmac and runways. When attempting to quantify the potential carbon impact, we quickly discovered there wasn't a tool that allowed us to make informed design decisions at the concept phase around embodied and operational carbon. Pathfinder, which was developed by Pamela Conrad when she was at CMG, she's now a Loeb Fellow at Harvard, was great once you had the design and you had a bill of quantities that you could adjust to different material types. So we invented our own tool. We call it Carbon Conscience. This is the most comprehensive tool for calculating both operational and embodied carbon for landscape architecture, and we beta tested it on Ellinikon. This is how it works. It's essentially cataloging every single resource that you might have on site in existing conditions. It's looking at what design conditions you want to add in terms of new materials, new landscape typologies. It's pretty comprehensive. We discovered that big moves have big impacts, illustrating why landscape architects should not only be leading massive projects with a significant public realm component, but I would argue why landscape architects should be leading all urban design projects as well. I don't think urban design should be led by architects who create objects. So we use the results of those carbon-centered decisions to guide our design. For example, we used all of the mined concrete from the runways and tarmacs in playful ways in the more urban areas of the park, creating topography with rock-faced cliff edges, rock, which is actually the concrete, or by integrating it into massive fountain elements like the fountain at Olympic Square. In fact, not a single piece of material from demolition is leaving the site. It's all being put to use. We don't have a single dump truck load moving off our site, which for 650 acres is pretty remarkable. This fountain could have easily been built from granite or limestone or marble, which is plentiful in Greece, but instead it's sandblasted concrete from the existing runways. A total of nearly 30,000 square meters of concrete from those runways is reused playfully throughout the park. With its glimmering marble aggregate and no rebar, again, a climate like Greece allowed for that. You have about 30-inch thick slabs with marble aggregate, marble and quartzite, the size of golf balls, built in the 1930s for this airport. What was once underground and unseen, we're now honoring. And it's ubiquitous in the new design, from the highly sculptural, like the fountains and retaining walls, to everyday objects like benches and paving, to the purely functional, like crushing it and using it for all of our subbase beneath plazas, pathways, and roadways. This early goal setting with the client helped to build capital for client commitments to carbon positive design and links carbon to all design decisions from concept through construction. Here you can see the reclaimed concrete used as a retaining wall to create a dramatic cliff face that recalls the Acropolis. And here's a view from the pinnacle of that hill where we have a sunset wine bar with the concrete slabs featuring prominently as landscape elements. We also reduce carbon emissions by adaptively reusing existing architecture. In the background is one of only 3 airports in the world designed by Eero Saarinen. Who can name the other 2? Anyone?
JFK.
Yes? Washington Dulles. Yeah. Athens is lucky to have the 3rd. And we're going to be reusing the historic terminal building as a cultural and event center, which is the centerpiece of a grand event space that terraces down from the building towards the sea, emphasizing the former grandeur of that architecture. Now, carbon conscience also taught us with highly specific expected outcomes based on the ecoregion and specific plant species selection, just how critical our planting and ecological restoration strategies were to designing a carbon positive park. Ecological restoration strategies included an exclusive use of native and adaptive species, in situ tree preservation, the reuse of removed trees as landscape features, planting in groups for accelerated succession, saving the successional seed bank, and biomass management for fire protection. 70% of the park is designed as a demonstration of Greek landscape restoration, utilizing natural areas management techniques. And the remaining 30% is focused around high human contact areas and is strategically subdivided into zones that require only monthly or weekly care. We're planting over 31,287 trees, representing 86 species, which were selected for their ecosystem services and adaptability to the alkaline soils of the site. And they're sourced entirely within Greece, which is part of an accelerated succession approach that was born from necessity, but also increases biodiversity and establishes a regenerative landscape strategy for the site. The whole park will have over 3.3 million plants, and the scale of that presents challenges with procurement. So our design team collaborated with every single nursery in Greece, every single one, to create native seed mixes and a native palette that established a new standard for the industry in Greece. We also centered nature in the design for the 4 destination playgrounds throughout the park, creating an immersive experience for kids to learn, to touch, to engage with the landscape. These experiences were curated for different age brackets and experience levels. For the littlest kids, there are playgrounds that celebrate local wildlife and cultural symbols like the owl, who is always depicted with the goddess Athena for wisdom, or the Rainbow Gate, which is one of the 5 abstracted Olympic rings found throughout the sports-themed play area. And for older kids, there are progressively riskier play experiences that encourage adventurous play and foster a sense of independence as they explore beyond prescribed pathways. By design, our play elements are built from locally sourced natural materials with the lowest carbon footprint possible. We also included a massive agricultural zone which teaches about the site's history prior to its use as an airport as fertile agricultural land. These areas also include groves of citrus, olives, and almond trees, which can be reserved for private gatherings, like birthday parties, family reunions, weddings, as well as a series of active farms where produce will be used in the park's cafes, and demonstration gardens that allow children to till the soil and learn about productive landscapes. Finally, beyond the core of the park, Hellenikon's coastal front is over 2 kilometers long and will be the largest public beach in Athens. It's designed to be a very active space with ample shade, amphitheater-style seating, hammock groves, and a maritime-themed playground. With only 1 pedestrian bridge, though, crossing from the core of the park, this one is kind of creating the center of gravity with seating that allows for both active or passive experiences along the beachfront. This contiguous promenade takes on a more polished look adjacent to the marina and the Kengo Kuma-designed Riviera Galleria shopping center and the Norman Foster-designed Marina Tower. And quieter moments away from the extreme edges feature intimately scaled coves that highlight endemic plant species and the diverse coastal ecosystems of Greece. The goal of the entire park is to reinforce the Greek relationship with the landscape and reignite this ethos in a 21st century context that centers ecological restoration, carbon neutrality, and equitable access for all Athenians. This 650-acre park, which is about 3/4 the size of Central Park, will be entirely operationally carbon neutral on day one, and embodied carbon neutral in 30 years, which is unheard of. My last fallacy, which I didn't include in the title, is accolades. Now, the validation from peers that we're constantly seeking in our professional lives is something I think we all strive for. So don't get me wrong, I think awards are awesome. They bolster team confidence, they attract talent and clients, and they generally make what we are doing feel seen. But I think we should aim higher and ditch the navel gazing as a profession. Instead, I think what we should do should be measured by impact. I think it's something that you're likely all doing in your student work, but the private sector is still playing catch up with. So my goal at Sasaki is to make post-occupancy evaluations a part of all of our projects. We're just now beginning a mandate to collect baseline data on all new projects to provide a foundation for this research. We did it at Jiading Park in Shanghai, which is shown here, and it's honestly much more gratifying to see the metrics proving our hypothesis than it is to receive any award. When we started, the site was a disgusting mess of abandoned warehouses, fallow fields, and eutrophic canals. But our constructed wetlands improved water quality and encouraged wildlife to return. We always prefer third-party independent research, so we teamed with East China Normal University in Shanghai to lead the study. It had incredible results with our green infrastructure and phytoremediation strategies. You're going to hear a lot about phytoremediation, I bet, from Kate Kennan next month, who I went to school with. But these strategies reduce nitrogen in the waterways by 66% and phosphorus by 97%. And these photos, I think, look way better when we actually know what we designed is working as intended. But we didn't stop there. After Jiading, our design for Xuhui Runway Park in Shanghai received the first site's gold rating in China. And our design for Julong Bay in Shenzhen received the first site's platinum designation in Asia. In fact, Sasaki's designed 2 of the 5 sites designated projects in all of China. Beyond the post-occupancy evaluations, we're trying to do more of in-house or going through the site certification process. We're also huge fans of the Landscape Architecture Foundation's Landscape Performance Series work, and we submit multiple projects to the Case Study Investigation Program every year so that these best practices can be shared more broadly with the profession and with students. We also run our own internal research grant program at Sasaki, which is a very competitive process that provides teams of Sasakians with both the time and a budget to dive deeper into an issue that's on their minds, but will also position us as thought leaders in front of future clients. So our work with sea level rise in Boston led us to being hired to write both the Climate Ready Boston Plan as well as a heat resilient strategy for the city of Boston. So we essentially invented those projects through an in-house grant and then got the city to pay us for the work and influenced the city in terms of their resiliency strategy. Our work entitled Climate Park Change is exploring the impact of wildfires and drought in the Intermountain West, which is a topic that often takes a backseat to coastal flooding. And much of this internally funded research goes on to become much bigger things, like Carbon Conscience, which started as an in-house research project that I was the principal sponsor of with a team at Sasaki. Chris Hardy, who was the principal investigator, is now expanding Carbon Conscience through the LAF Fellowship, where he was granted $25,000 to make this app public. I want to emphasize that Carbon Conscience is free and available for beta testing by all landscape architects. Olin's using it right now. Other firms are starting to use it. We could have made this proprietary, but doing that wouldn't change the world. So what inspires me every day is that this research is nonstop. At our most recent research fair 2 weeks ago, we were introduced to 24 different ongoing research projects at Sasaki, from creating building facades that double as bird habitat to how AI can be used in design. You're all probably already using ChatGPT to write your papers. You shouldn't be, but I know you are. And we're looking at ways to use AI to generate quick images that help us ideate. So to see those windows into the future of the practice, to me, is mind-boggling every day, and I get to do that at my job, which is like, I can't even believe it every day. We've also committed to starting our own nonprofit, the Sasaki Foundation, which provides funding for external researchers centered in underserved communities to study topics related to urbanization, gentrification, mobility, and equity. These are not intended to directly benefit Sasaki as a firm. In fact, there's a firewall between the two. This is a 501c3 nonprofit. But instead, it provides access to Sasaki staff and resources to help these external groups with their research. But most importantly, instead of accolades, awards, and even research, to me, the most important thing we need to be doing as landscape architects is messaging what we do to the masses. I'm a huge proponent of getting our work and ideas into the mainstream media, not just to the benefit of the firm, but to increase the visibility, the credibility, and the value of landscape architecture as a profession. I want the world to know what we do so that we're the ones leading the way to find solutions to these challenging social issues. For me, advocacy is a daily activity. Beyond the op-eds and articles and lectures, my most important work is instilling in my kids a deep appreciation for nature. Their wonder, their awe, their inherent desire for environmental justice inspires me every day, and it gives me hope for the future. This manifests itself in what might seem the smallest of ways, but which are actually quite profound. Like last month when I was helping them sort their Legos, and they commented that there wasn't nearly enough green to build the parks and forests that they needed. For me, that innocent statement was a small win, but a proxy for what's happening around us in the real non-Lego world. So if I'm an advocate for anything, it's to move as far as you can, as much as you can, across oceans or across town, walk in someone else's shoes, eat their food, immerse yourself in their culture. We try to do this every day from our 4 offices by traveling frequently or simply experiencing other traditions by celebrating cultural high holidays in the office together. I think there's a huge world out there waiting not just to be explored, but to be cherished and protected. And landscape architects are some of the best equipped professionals to do that. My goal is to make sure that landscape architecture is no longer parochial, but global. And our societal issues, I think, are interrelated, interdependent, and international. So for me, working globally isn't glamorous, it's necessary. Thank you.